All right, I think it's good. I don't know if Aruna is on, is he? I don't think so. So I think we can. Sorry, I'll turn on the camera. We can start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. Our Lord, make us worthy to pray. Thank you, our Father who art in heaven. Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord, thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Ray, it's always good to have you.
Thank you. So you
Keep
can still
coming.
think that by the end.
No, keep coming, please. The
Sounds good, man.
floor is yours.
Thanks, buddy. Okay, and so I'm good. The mic works and everything. I'm totally hearable.
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. So the talk today is about faith. And this is a very, very, very difficult topic to talk about. Not least of all because right now is probably one of the most important topics to talk about. It's also probably the most misunderstood virtue or concept in our modern day world. It's incredibly misunderstood. And I think that the title of this talk should be a shock enough for you to understand that I'm talking about something entirely different, because the talk I'm going to be talking is called Fear and Trembling. It's the most profound reverence. So, a couple of disclaimers, as I usually like to do. I'm an absolutist. So, I believe what I believe. I genuinely think I'm right. And I think that there are some things that when we talk about, um, out of respect to the nature of the topics, we have to be absolute. There is no not absoluteness when it comes to the reality of the body and blood of Christ being the body and blood of Christ. It's not the body and blood of Christ ish. It's not depending. It is the body and blood of Christ, full stop. And I believe to that same degree that I'm willing to be absolutist with what I believe about faith. And in that setting, I'd like to say that I'm either right or I'm wrong. Okay. It will be the job of the listener to decide whether I'm right or I'm wrong. But what's not up for debate on my end is that I'm right-ish. Because faith, for us to be honest about it, we have to go where the evidence leads. We have to ask ourselves very serious questions, and we have to be willing to convict ourselves. So I want to start here with another disclaimer that this talk is going to be hard to give linearly. I'll be doing a lot of jumping around, and I'm sorry about that. I did try to think through how I can make it as linear as possible, but it's hard. So what I'm going to ask, and this kind of makes sense in the context of the group of people that I'm talking to, is you are grads, so you have a bit more of that ability to track thoughts and to make connections. So actively work on making connections and trying to internalize what I'm saying, as opposed to following through, listening, from point A to point B. I can't get my message across that way. The other thing is that questions at the end, if there are any, I'd like for them to be mainly just about the content of the talk rather than, but that would means, you know what I mean? So, but if what you're saying is true, that would mean X, Y, and Z. I'd like for it to be just questions about the content, because the content has very serious repercussions. All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about this gentleman right here. This gentleman right here, his name is Soren Kierkegaard. He was a philosopher, writer, and he wrote a very good book that I recommend everybody read. Everybody. It's called Fear and Trembling. I have my copy right here. This book is the backbone of the discussion that we're going to have today. So my thoughts are either going to be straight out of the words used by Soren Kierkegaard. I might say Soren says this, but if I forget, I'm not claiming these are my thoughts. There are some thoughts that I have meditated and added to this, but a lot of this is based on the thoughts of Soren Kierkegaard. I'll do some quoting of him as well. I highly recommend reading this book. And there's a reason I recommend reading this book is because Soren wrote this book sometime between the age of 19 and 23. And it is unbelievable the thoughts that a, call him 23-year-old guy had, for him to write a book that resonated through centuries this way. And he spends most of the book contemplating the life of Abraham. Okay. And at the very beginning, he takes a moment to contemplate his life, contemplating Abraham. And I want to read a segment here of what he writes, because it'll set the ground, again, for the lofty degree of speech that we're going to have about faith. So if you guys could just listen, I'm going to read at length. This is Soren Kierkegaard talking about himself. Once upon a time, there was a man who as a child had heard the beautiful story about how God tempted Abraham and how he endured temptation, kept the faith, and a second time received again a son contrary to expectation. When the child became older, so the child being Soren, he read the same story with even greater admiration. For life had separated what was united in the pious simplicity of the child. The older he became, the more frequently his mind reverted to that story. His enthusiasm became greater and greater, and yet he was less and less able to understand the story. At last, in his interest for that, he forgot everything else. His soul had only one wish, to see Abraham, one longing, to have been witness to that event, specifically the event of Abraham murdering Isaac. One longing, to have been witness to that event. His desire was not to behold the beauty of the countries of the Orient, or the earthly glory of the promised land, or that God-fearing couple whose old age God had blessed, or the venerable figure of the aged patriarch, or the vigorous young manhood of Isaac, whom God had bestowed on Abraham. He saw no reason why the same thing might not have been placed on a barren heath in Denmark. His yearning was to accompany them on the 3 days' journey when Abraham rode with Sarah before him and with Isaac by his side. His only wish was to be present at that time when Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw Mount Moriah afar off, at that time when he left the asses behind him and went alone with Isaac up unto the mountain. For what his mind was intent upon was not the indigenous web of imagination, but that shudder of thought. That man was not a thinker. He felt no need of getting beyond faith. That's an important line there. He felt no need of getting beyond faith. He deemed it the most glorious thing to be remembered as the father of it, an enviable lot to possess it, even though no one else were to know it. That man was not a learned exegete. He didn't know Hebrew, and if he had known Hebrew, he perhaps would have easily understood Abraham and the story. Soren asks, he mentions there, not moving beyond it. Why is this relevant? Why is faith relevant now more than ever? And that's a very pandemic thing to say, now more than ever. Every commercial right now begins with now more than ever, and then insert some random thing here for them to push phone cards on you. But why is this relevant? Now more than ever, we're at a crisis of faith. Real questions are being asked. Does God and can God? Those are probably the two most commonly asked questions that we answer, whether as Christians or as non-believers, and that the church has had to answer and will increasingly have to answer over the coming years in light of what's been happening here. Does God and can God? Why is this important? Descartes, you guys know Descartes, René Descartes. I think, therefore I am, right? I do not think, therefore I do not am. So he was the father of doubt, right? And it became this thing that everybody wanted to doubt. Everybody said, let's get beyond faith, right? The philosophers, let's get beyond faith and let's doubt. If I were to walk into neurosurgery, me, my goof self, and walk in and go, guys, let's get beyond endarterectomies. The first question that you might reasonably ask me is, do you know what an endarterectomy is? Do you know the evidence for it? Do you know any data about it? And so when people say we need to move beyond faith, first question is, have you gotten to faith? Have you understood it? And where are you going beyond it? Like, where is it? What is it? For you to ask the question of how to move beyond it to where? And this is the amazing thing about Kierkegaard's book. It's at a time where the cool philosophical thing to do was doubt. He actually takes a step back and says, hold on, none of you guys have understood faith. So you're talking way above your pedigree here. I think it's also important to note as we discuss faith that I'm not going to mince words. Faith is stupid. Faith is unknown. Faith doesn't claim to have answers that it doesn't have, and it doesn't ask questions that it doesn't want to ask. Faith is stubborn and rigid. Faith is unknowing. This is a story, this picture here is of Abba Joseph. So this is a story in the Paradise of the Fathers. And I always laugh when I read this story. So Abba Joseph's disciple asked him, how do I pray? How do I become like you, and how do I pray? And Abba Joseph tells him, well, if you want, you can become totally like fire, right? If you want, you can become wholly unto fire, is what he says. And the disciple, as confused or more confused when he asks the first question, goes, how? And then Abba Joseph does this hilarious thing, and I laugh out loud whenever I talk about it. It says he lifts up his hands and fire comes out of them, right? Like in this picture here. And he goes to his disciple and says, what, you can't do this? Like, it almost sounds like he's being a jerk, but it was a serious question. Like, what do you mean, how? Just do this. You know, somebody says, I'm thirsty. Well, drink water. And they go, how? And you go, well, you don't know how to pour water? Because it's so simple. Faith takes the most complicated things and simplifies them, not by answering questions, but by being entirely unconcerned with the answers to those questions. They're irrelevant, right? Faith, we have this faith sort of in medicine, where you give somebody a blood pressure medication, be like, this will lower your blood pressure, and sure enough, they go to the doctors 4 to 6 weeks later, and the blood pressure's dropped. You hardly go, well, how? And then they go, well, there's calcium channel blockers and there's this ligate. And if you attach this ligand to the enzyme, it does this. Those things don't change the fact. They might explain it, but they don't change the fact that this drug did this. And so for the faithful, the answers of the how and the why and the whens and the whats are not very important. The importance is the outcomes. Abba Joseph didn't ask, well, is there a hydrocarbon in me that combusts? He just goes, well, just do this. And that is one element of faith that we want to talk about. But to go back to Soren Kierkegaard, he spends most of his time talking about Abraham. And this story is where we're really going to spend the bulk of our discussion, because this story is the discussion of faith that I want to have. So first, let's read the story at length. And I'm going to read it because it's hard to get people to read over Zoom. So God says, where are you, Abraham? And he says, here I am. Then God said, take your son. And then God really rubs it in. By the way, your only son, okay, whom you love, by the way. So God really lets him know, this is not passive. I want this to hurt. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Mount Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Okay? Not just take your son, that guy, and go slaughter him outside, which would have been hard enough. But God makes it even more difficult. It says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and his name is Isaac, and take him a 7 days journey away and kill him there, and I'll show you where I want you to kill him. Then early the next morning, and I highlighted that for a reason, early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. So Abraham looks up and sees Mount Moriah. He said to the servants, "You stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there. We will worship and we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife as the two of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" And then Abraham says to him, "Yes, my son." "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." The rest is not important to me. The rest is not important to the discussion. But this agonizing story, Kierkegaard said, kept him up for nights. What is it in this story that kept Kierkegaard up for nights? I think one of the most important things that we can take away from this is the unity of Abraham and God's will. Verse 3 says, "Early in the morning." So Abraham doesn't get up late, like when I don't want to go to work and I have a hard time getting up. He gets up early in the morning. Abraham, why early? Why early? You're about to walk 7 days to Mount Moriah. Sleep in just a little bit. Have your son around you just a little bit. Maybe let your wife know, "Hey, I'm going for a dangerous journey. People have lost their sons there before. I'll do my best, but who knows?" Like have that conversation. No. Abraham wakes up early in the morning like somebody excited to do something. And then it says, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. This is not a man dragging his heels to do something that he doesn't want to do. This is a man walking with dedication and conviction. He looks up and looks at this mountain and doesn't shudder. He stares at it, turns to his servants and says, "You stay here. You don't come with me." Why, Abraham? Hey, you're the master. They'll do what they tell you. They'll do what you tell them. Have them at least load the wood. No, I do this. I don't want anybody stopping me from what I'm about to do. You stay here. And look at him unwavering when Isaac looks up to Abraham and says, "Father?" "Yes, my son." This confidence, almost unabashedly. And he says, "Where's the lamb?" Busted, right? That's how you would feel. Busted. I'm going to have to tell him I'm going to kill him. But Abraham, with total calmness, as a God will provide the lamb. He knows who the lamb is. He knows who the lamb is. But if you were to tell Isaac, he would run away and then he wouldn't have a chance to kill him. This sounds gory. And I think that's why Fear and Trembling is a really good title for this book. Because what actually happened here is that Abraham wasn't resigned to the commandment of God. He didn't say, "I guess I have to do this." In that moment, when God tells Abraham, "This is my will," Abraham doesn't say, "I'll do your will." Abraham says, "I will make your will my will." Abraham takes on the will of God and he makes it his own. And I want to read Kierkegaard. Again, this is where it becomes a bit more of literature. And he imagines this interaction. So this is not at all what actually happened, but it's a meditation. "It was early in the morning. Abraham arose. He had the asses saddled, left his tent and Isaac with him. But Sarah looked out of the window after them until they had passed down the valley and she could see them no more. They rode in silence for 3 days. On the morning of the fourth day, Abraham said never a word, but he lifted up his eyes and saw Mount Moriah afar off. He left the young men behind and went on alone with Isaac beside him up to the mountain. But Abraham said to himself, I will not conceal from Isaac where this course leads him. He stood still. He laid his hand upon the head of Isaac in benediction, and Isaac bowed to receive the blessing. And in Abraham's faith was fatherliness. His look was mild, his speech encouraging. Again, total calmness. But Isaac was unable to understand him. His soul could not be exalted. He embraced Abraham's knees. He fell at his feet imploringly. He begged for his young life, for the fair hope of his future. He called to mind the joy in Abraham's house. Dad, remember when we used to run around? Why are you going to kill me? Remember when you used to chase me through the fields? He called to mind the joy in Abraham's house. He called to mind the sorrow and loneliness. Dad, you're going to go back and I'm your only son. There's nobody. You're going to have to tell mom you killed me. But then Abraham lifted up the boy. He walked with him by his side, and his talk was full of comfort and exhortation. This is what we have to do. But Isaac could not understand him. He climbed Mount Moriah, but Isaac could not understand him. Then for an instant, he turned away from him. And when Isaac saw Abraham's face, it was changed. His glance was wild. His form was horror. He seized Isaac by the throat, threw him to the ground, and said, "Stupid boy, do you suppose that I am your father? I am an idolater. Do you suppose that this is God's will? No, this is my desire." Then Isaac trembled and cried out in terror, "O God in heaven, have compassion on me. God of Abraham, have compassion on me. If I have no father on this earth, then you be my father." But Abraham, in a low voice, said to himself, "O Lord in heaven, I thank thee. After all, it is better for him to believe that I am a monster rather than that he should lose faith in you." And then Kierkegaard meditates. When the child must be weaned, the mother blackens her breast. So the child believes that the breast has changed, but the mother is the same, her glance ever loving and tender as ever. In this imagination of what happened, which is not necessarily what happened, but this imagination of what happened, Abraham is so encapsulated by God's will that he totally lives it. And he would rather that Isaac die thinking my dad is a bad person, rather than that Isaac should die thinking God asked my dad to do this bad thing. This is determination. It is the absence of resignation. And this is a very important point that I want us to take away. Faith is not resignation. Resignation is a cheap surrogate for faith. Okay? Resignation is a cheap surrogate for faith, and that's exactly the words that Kierkegaard used. He said, "I would have done a greater deed than Abraham. Yet this is the greatest falsehood, for my resignation was the surrogate for faith." Trigger warning, I'm going to talk about surrogates for faith. And I don't mean to call anything out, but I do mean to make a point. We, as humans, have weaknesses. Resignation is a human weakness. But let's not confuse that for faith. Let's give faith its due exaltation. Here's what resignation sounds like. Okay? At a funeral and somebody passes, and you say, "They're in a better place now." Forgive me. Neither the person saying this nor the person hearing it are offering proof, and both of them are sure very happy that nobody has proof of either. Resignation is what we often say when we can't control something and we try to make peace with it. This is not what Abraham did, because Abraham doesn't get there early to the mountain to get it over with. Abraham doesn't just tell God, "Look, I'll slaughter him outside my tent, but I'm not walking 7 days knowing I'm going to kill my son." Not happening. Abraham doesn't get there early, like somebody trying to get it over with. He doesn't get there late. He gets there right exactly on time. He doesn't hide his face until he gets to Mount Moriah. He sees it from a distance and says, "That's where I'm going. That's where I'm going to kill my son. Anything that can get in my way, you stay here." He gets up before his wife gets up, lest she ask him where you're going. He tells his servants, "You stay here because I don't want you following me and stopping me from what I'm about to do." There's no resignation in this. There is desire. Faith takes the undesirable and says, "No, I will make it my desire." Here's the opposite of faith and resignation in the Bible. Moses. God tells Moses, speak to this rock and it will produce water. Moses knows God's capability. He's walked through the Red Sea. He's seen manna come down. But Moses is resigned. He's had enough. So instead of talking to the rock, he says, look, I know you're going to bring water out anyways. So here's a little tap, bring the water and let's get on with it. That's resignation. This is not somebody, unlike Abraham, who totally brings himself into God's will and says, I will want what you want. Right? Resignation is platitudes. Resignation, unfortunately, breeds resentment. And let's go back to the story of Isaac and Abraham. You have the conversation after. So after the ram is killed and now Abraham's got to walk 7 days back with Isaac. Pretty awkward. I mean, Isaac's going to have to ask, what happened back there? Like, what was that? Now, if Abraham were to say, well, God wouldn't leave me alone. He kept speaking in my ear and he's a really loud guy. And I couldn't tell him no. Isaac would have a very reasonable answer. So you love your own peace of mind more than you love me? You're willing to kill me just so God can get off your back? That's what it's all about? You're not willing to suffer God yelling in your ear for me? Resignation would have bred resentment. But in fact, what we do know is that Abraham embraces his son, and his son brings him generations of children. They grow old together. Because there's no resentment, because there was no resignation. Abraham looks to him and says, I believed in that moment that it was the right thing to do. And by the way, Isaac, I would do it again. I would do it again if I believed it was the right thing to do. Because before I am your father, I am a good father. I do what is right. Resignation breeds resentment. Faith breeds love. If you resign to the will of God, you will eventually resent him. And you being me. Because I've so resigned so many things to the will of God. And I end up resenting it. I eventually, maybe not now, but when I'm 80, I'll be like, and when you took this away from me, I said, fine. I said, fine. And this is how you repay me? That's how resentment is bred. But if what God does for you, you say, no, that's actually what I would have wanted to. And you like Abraham, take that will onto you. There is no resentment. Okay, read something again here from Kierkegaard. We have to be careful of the platitudes that we use. Okay, he says this: there surely is no instant need. There surely is no instant need. It is not worthwhile sorrowing before the time. These are things that people say. There's no need. Don't stress about it before it happens. One cannot know what is going to happen. Maybe it won't happen after all. And he says these caricatures of faith are part and parcel of life's wretchedness, and the infinite resignation has already consigned them to infinite contempt. Resignation leads to contempt. These things, these platitudes that we say, we need to be careful with our language. Well, maybe it won't happen after all. This is not faith. This is resignation. Soren Kierkegaard, I don't know if you know this, but he was really the one who popularized the term leap of faith. You say, take a leap of faith. And I didn't know this until I read this book, but what Soren's speaking about when he says leap of faith is very different than the one we think of, because he talks about a gymnast jumping, doing that leap into the unknown, right? Into where there's no steady footing. But it's only worth anything if that steady footing lands in actual footing. If a gymnast, jumps from one hoop and then doesn't catch the other hoop and then just falls to the floor, it's not really impressive. Good job on the jump, but right? And if the gymnast somehow jumped in the air and then just stayed there, kind of get bored. Like, where's the landing? And if a gymnast jumped in the air and did a 360 hoop de loop or whatever, if there's any gymnasts listening, I'm sorry, I don't know the art form, and lands and lands a terrible landing, probably get a -2 from the Russian judge, right? Because the value is in sticking the landing. this is very important to understand, is that if faith only jumps into the unknown, it's not faith, it's resignation. Faith has to jump back and land into the known. Just stopping in the unknown is not impressive. And that's what I mean by the platitudes of simply saying, although there are those who believe they are in a better place, and that could very well be faith, and I'm not speaking to that. But when we just say they're in a better place, that's us just jumping in the air and being so thankful that we don't have to come down, that there's no real ceiling there that we can actually hit. It's just jumping in the air. Faith jumps into the now, where you say, a real faith would say, no, if I wanted to, and if I prayed for this, I could get this done. If I prayed and if I asked God to move this mountain, he would move the mountain because he said he would. That's why. I don't have the answers of how it would move. I don't know how its roots would pull up from the earth. All I know is this. He said yes, therefore, if I asked, it happens. In fact, that's why Christ says faith the size of a mustard seed. Because if your faith was any bigger, you'd probably be full of yourself and you start asking these questions. It takes this teeny tininess. It takes this littleness of, he said, therefore, period at the end. There are no questions. I don't know. I don't know how. I don't know. Would there be a pit in the earth? I don't know. Would the new place, would God carve out a place for the mountain to come land in, or would it be on a perch? I don't know. He just said he would do it. And that's all I know. And this leads us to a very important thing, is that faith is so powerful. Faith is so powerful that it holds God accountable. And it knows that, and forgive me for the presumptuousness, faith knows that it can even move the will of God. And I'll give you examples. This is the wedding at Cana of Galilee. So you have this story, and let me pull out the text because that's really important. John 2:2-4. So, and Jesus' disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. Here's the key. "My hour has not yet come." He doesn't tell her, "I'm not feeling it." He doesn't tell her, "I'm tired." He doesn't tell her, there's boiled eggs clearly right in front of him in that picture. I'm just going to eat those. He says, "My time has not yet come." This is him speaking about the divine will of the Father. And this is to the Virgin Mary, who the Gospel of Luke describes as having come in the fullness of time. So if there's one person who understands the will of God as it relates to time and its value, it is the Virgin Mary. And what Christ tells her is not, "I don't want to." He says, "It is not yet my time." You are intervening with the will of God. And you know what she does? She turns to the servant and says, "Whatever he says to do, do it." What confidence is that? This is confidence in knowing that my son promised me, whatever I ask of him, he will do. And so I don't care if he tells me it is not my time. I want you to do this. Will you do it for me? That is the kind of confidence that real faith can command. Now, I'm not saying let's pretend we have this faith and be presumptuous against God. But I'm saying that this is the lofty faith that we're speaking of. And that's why this talk is about fear and trembling, because you should be fearful and trembling at hearing these things. Another example of avoiding platitudes and avoiding pretending like God can't, because this is the key here. On the Mount of Temptation, the devil really tries to take Christ's faith away from him. Right? He tries to take Christ's faith away. That was the temptation. The temptation was not in being thrown off the mountain. The temptation was in getting God to say something. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up on their hands so that you will not strike your foot against the stone." I don't think the temptation that the devil actually wanted was for Christ to throw himself off the mountain. I think the key is in Christ's response. He said, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." You know how Christ probably would have failed that temptation if he said something like, "Well, devil, you're kind of taking it out of context, because I feel like God may have meant that, but he was being hyperbolic. So I think, right, trying to justify away this promise of God. He will command his angels concerning you." Christ doesn't doubt this. He says in his head, probably, if I did throw myself off of this temple, he would send his angels, and not a foot of my, I will not strike my foot against a stone. Nevertheless, I don't want to do it. The temptation that Christ came over here was not in not throwing himself off the mountain. It was in explaining away the verse that the devil put ahead of him. It was in saying, but God didn't mean that. Or caveat, unless it's God's will. He says, no, it is true. If I did it, I wouldn't be, but I won't. Because that's faith. As important is this story of Christ in Gethsemane and what faith can do, and yet the discipline of faith to not do it. Okay, so what faith can do, and yet the discipline of faith to not do it. So first we'll read Matthew 26. I'll pull up Matthew 26 here. Also, you guys want to know something funny? I realized today while I was preparing this talk, I don't think I have a physical Bible in my house, which is a problem. Okay, so going a little farther, this is Matthew 26, verse 39. Going a little farther, he fell to his face to the ground in the Garden of Gethsemane. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken away from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." So in that statement, Christ says, I know that you have a will, and I know what that will is. Right? That's why he's sweating blood. Because I know what your will is. It's the cross. And Christ says, I know your will, and that's why I'm praying that you take it away from me. Then he returned to the disciples, found them sleeping. We'll go back to verse 42. He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." So, in those two verses, Christ clearly acknowledges he has no doubt what the will of God is. His will is that he drinks this cup. And then Christ says, okay, in that moment, right? Verse 2, may your will be done. In that moment is the commitment. Hell or high water, I'm drinking this cup. I am going to go through with my murder. Go down to verse 53. You have the story of Peter striking Malchus's ear off. And then was Malchus the servant or the high priest? Peter takes off somebody's ear. Okay. And then Christ says to him, "Put your sword back in its place." Jesus said to him, "For all who draw with the sword will die by the sword." And then here's the kicker. "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" Hold on, Jesus. You just said that you agree that the will of God is your death. He goes, yeah, nevertheless, if I asked him, he would send 12 million of angels. Do you doubt it? The only reason there aren't 12 million angels here is not because it's his will that there aren't. It's because it's my will that I haven't asked. And yet I'm confident that if I did ask, it would be. And that is the other side of the faith of Isaac to Abraham and Abraham to Isaac. In that unity of the Father and the Son is the mystery of faith. The faith to not ask for what is not God's will because you are so in love with God that you don't want anything that isn't his will. This is scary. This is scary. It can be vile. Faith looks at Faith looks at somebody's like mother struggling with cancer and doesn't go, I want it cured. Ask the simple question, what is God's will? And if that becomes God's will, sure, I want it. I want it. And only that faith can really, really move mountains. But this is lofty. And I acknowledge that this is lofty. And I don't have faith. In fact, Soren Kierkegaard says that the only person in the Bible who really has the kind of faith he's talking about is Abraham. So this is lofty. And let me pull back and say that we're not expected to have this faith. We're not expected to just simply come up with this faith on our own. It's impossible. It is more impossible than moving the mountain. So then what do? Faith is something that's given to us by God. It's a mystery of our unity with Him. It's a mystery of theosis, of deification, of becoming of Him. It's something that He gives us in that, and it's something that takes a lifetime to realize. But I'll answer the question very simply as Abba Joseph with, do you not know how to do this? Do you want to know how you get faith? Ask. Ask. Let's bring Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, into this. Mark 9:24. Or let's start with 20. Let's start with 20. So they brought him in. This is the man filled with demons. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Then Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for the one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, Lord, I believe. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. And in that moment, Christ gives him the faith such that this man had his son freed from the demons. It can be as simple as that. Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. But it takes an admission of unbelief for us to get that faith, for us to be able to ask of him that faith. There is a sacrifice, and that sacrifice is our own ego. The sacrifice and the price to pay for faith is faithfulness. And I'm going to separate the two here. Faith is everything we've talked about now. Faithfulness is not a cheap substitute for it. It's a prerequisite for it. Faithfulness means avoiding lying to ourselves and lying to others. Faithfulness involves when somebody tells me, Ray, why did you not move a mountain? I don't say it wasn't God's will. I don't say, well, why would I move a mountain? I say, because I don't have faith. For faith to be given, you have to be faithful and not minimize the value of faith. Not say, well, I guess I believe as much as belief can really happen. I mean, come on, you curing demons. Come on, Jesus. You really expect me to believe that? Can you just do it and prove it to me or something? He goes, no, I believe, but help my unbelief. There's unbelief in me. There is unbelief in me. Help me. Avoid excuses. Okay? Stop looking for reasons to justify your unbelief. Stop looking for caveats in the Bible to justify why we don't have faith that God can do. Admit that we don't have faith and ask him for that faith. But if all we do is try to justify ourselves in front of him, he won't justify us. If all we do is say this or God cannot, or the Eucharist cannot, or faith does not, we'll never have faith. because we're not faithful. Before we ask for faith, we need to be faithful. And that's the takeaway point here. As we look around in our lives, let's carry with us the loftiness of faith, what faith can do, what faith is able to do, and stop at nothing, even the will of God, that is the power of faith. Let's hold it up on the pedestal and acknowledge that we aren't there yet, and beg him, but only with faithfulness and acknowledging our lack of faith. Excuses are not the answer. I think that's all I have. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
So my question is specifically about...
You're never on the call, by the way, until the last 2 minutes where you start really throwing wrenches, eh?
That's not actually true. I was on Facebook.
No, I know, but I couldn't see your name.
Yeah, well, I understand that it's intimidating to speak in front of me, so I thought I'd at least close the camera. So that whole idea of the difference between faith and faithfulness, right? And how it is specifically that you're hinting at this idea that if I don't do something, it's because I lack faith. The prayer that you brought up, this whole idea of how it is, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Is he then a liar to say I believe? Should he not just have stuck to help my unbelief? Because I think what I'm hearing you say is that, Ray, why didn't you move mountains? Is because I don't have faith, is what you're proposing, right? Not I lack faith, not I don't have enough faith. What you were proposing is I don't have any. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we do the exact same thing with, it's I don't love God enough, or, many times we'll just say, I guess I just don't love God, right? It's all or nothing. And many of the arguments that we have within ourselves. So is that prayer then that guy prays, is it insincere?
No, not necessarily. I think if it was insincere, it wouldn't have worked. I can't speak to the heart of that guy. I don't know if he had faith. I don't know. So I don't know what he should have said or shouldn't have said. Probably a good question for him. But what I do know is Christ deemed him at least to be faithful in that moment, in his honesty. If you have no faith, accept that you have no faith. If you have some faith, accept that. I can't speak to the heart of anybody. I can speak to myself. In so much as faith can be quantified, something not tangible can be quantified. I put myself on the lower end of the spectrum, functionally enough to say I have no faith. But hey, if you have some faith, yeah, offer it to him as well. Offer what I guess what I'm saying is offer what you have, but be very clear about what you don't have.
Is it then quantifiable?
I don't know, because in the same sense that love would be quantified. I mean, you can't tell your wife, I love you, help my lack of love to you.
Right.
Like, she'd be like, what do you mean your lack of love to me? Like for him, needy.
Well, although I think it's a very stupid thing to say to your wife. However, I do think it's a very, it's a statement that actually has that much more power than to simply say, I love you infinitely or whatever, which is very clearly not true. Mm-hmm. Right? If we're being real. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you think Abraham is stupid?
That's a really good question. And at the risk of judging, the patriarch of us all, yes, and intensely wisely so.
Intensely wisely so.
Yes.
Help me.
Because Abraham has one goal in mind. And that is the will of God. The details are irrelevant to him. It's not because he cannot look into the details. This is at this time, in human development, he was the only real connection between humanity. He was a symbol of humanity and God, right? So he could really, right? He could really be like, well, look, for him, so I can help them understand. I mean, God didn't pick him because he was a fool. But Abraham chooses folly. He chooses kill your son. That's what I'm doing. How foolish is it to kill your son? And to not ask questions. Come on, bro. Ask a few questions. And he goes, what difference does it make? The defining factor of right and wrong has told me to do something. Therefore, it is right. The rest I can work out later.
What do you think of what St. Paul says about him later on in Hebrews, where how it is that St. Paul is capable of picking up on the fact that, and I'm sure this must have existed in the teachings of the Jews, because like Paul must have picked it up somewhere as he was, a student of Gamaliel. But Paul ends up saying in Hebrews about how it is that Abraham acted out of the conviction that he knew that even if he killed him, because he promised that his descendants would be like the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, God would figure it out.
Yeah. And sorry, I forgot. I had meant to mention that as well, because Kierkegaard talks about that, where
Does
Abraham had this. Yeah, he does. He's like, look, one of a million things could have happened. Either Abraham was like this, what happened would happen, or as it's piercing the skin, his knife would break, or he would die and come back to life, or he would die and still be able to bring him children. He doesn't know. He knows he doesn't. You know what it's like? It's Abraham. Abraham had the kind of faith in of the resurrection, where people tell me, okay, Ray, but sick because of God's will. And I hear this even from like members of the church and faithful people. They say, but we need, and I go, yeah, dead people don't become undead either. But it happened. I don't know how it happened. Dead people do not rise. The dead should be dead. That's the definition. Dead people are not alive. That's axiomatic. Like 1 + 1 is 2. Dead are not live, right? And yet, we base the whole faith on that.
Yeah.
So Abraham sort of had that, where he doesn't know what could happen, but he has, God said this, therefore it's right. God make a promise, therefore he keeps it. The rest is me carrying out that.
Yeah.
And insofar as he believed that God would truly bring about this endpoint, he was excited to kill Isaac, because in his mind, in some way, him killing Isaac was contributing to the fact that Isaac could give him children. How stupid does that sound? Very. But him moving towards the murder of his only son, he believed that because God said to do it, and God said that no matter what, this would be the outcome, he believed that he was contributing to it. Isaac, this is how I give you sons to light up the night sky, by killing you.
It's funny how it is that Abraham, while he might himself not understand the faith that he has, one thing he does trust is that God is faithful in his promises to him. Maybe that's what motivates him. Thanks. That's good, Ray. Thanks, man.
Thanks, man. Any other questions? Can I actually like straight up actually read the book like it's a really good book? Like it's frighteningly good.
It's worth the read?
Oh, it's the best book.
I'll take you up on it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ray. Johanna, what's next?
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Abuela. So we'll continue part 3 next time of the 4-part series. It's going to be Waitings for God's Work. So looking forward to next week with part 3.
Thanks, Johanna. All right, my beloved. We'll go ahead and say a final prayer, and we'll wish everyone a wonderful day. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, bestowing life upon those who are in the tombs. Through your holy intercessions with the Holy Virgin Mother, St. Mary, and all the saints who have pleased you since the beginning, please, Lord, accept our prayers and make us worthy to pray thankfully. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Now may the love of God the Father, the grace of his only begotten Son, our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ, the gift and the communion of the Holy Spirit with you all. Go in peace. May the peace of the Lord be with you. God bless you all. Habibi.